We have liftoff.
Thank you so much for speaking with me. I
Mm,
really appreciate it. I really enjoy your introductory to logic. Uh, so I wanted to speak with you a little bit about what logic kind of is, and more importantly, what its role is in our modern world. But the first question I have to ask you is you grew up in quite a crazy time period. You grew up in post-World War II London. How did that impact your young life, and how did that push you to studying mathematics and logic at Cambridge?
okay. Um, so I was a teenager in the 60s, okay, in London. And that was an amazing decade. I think maybe in retrospect, it's the most significant decade of the 20th century
Mhm.
because post-war London, like Europe and a lot of the Western world, um, was pretty grim. I mean, it was recovering from the war. There were lots of restrictions on food, uh, and culture. Uh, and the 60s changed all that. I mean, it was called in Britain the swinging 60s because everything changed and the new generation changed the music, the mores, the outlook on life. I mean, there was an economic boom after the the war. Um, so the economy was growing, the young people had money, music was revolutionized by people like the Beatles, sexual mores changed because of the pill. So it was a really exciting time to be around. Uh, okay, so I was sort of part of that. Um, Something else that happened after the war in Britain was there was a Labour government, which was probably the most radical Labour government that uh, Britain had ever seen or has ever seen since. So what it did was it nationalised a lot of the power services, like electricity, uh, the transport service like British Rail. It founded the National Health System. Um, uh, so it introduced a lot of socialist reforms that hadn't been possible before. And one thing it did was free up the universities. So I was a working class kid, and it was impossible previously for a working class kid to go to university. No one could afford it. But the Labour government made universities essentially free, or at least fees were abolished. Living grants were given, funded by local authorities. So it made it possible for people like me to go to university. And so I applied and was accepted, and I went, and it was really a change for me because I was moving from a working class environment to a very bourgeois environment. Um, and I suppose I've remained sort of bourgeois ever since. So I've never really lost my working class roots. Um, I went to a secondary school which was relatively academic. There I fell in love with mathematics. Um, and so I applied. And in the UK, when you go to university, you study only one subject. Essentially, you might do a minor in something, but it's quite unlike the US or the Australian system, where essentially you do quite a large number of subjects in the first year, and then you maybe sort of specialize as you go on. But I studied mathematics. Uh, and I wasn't that good at it. You know, I was good at school, but then when you go to university, you suddenly find yourself with a lot of people who have been good at school. Okay, and I discovered there are lots of people better than I was. But actually, I carried on, and I did my doctorate in mathematics. But by that time, I'd already fallen in love with philosophy, and so I applied for math job and philosophy jobs, and for reasons I still don't understand, I was offered a job in the philosophy department, so I jumped at it, and I've been a philosopher ever since.
What kind of pushed you initially towards philosophy and then eventually into logic?
Yeah, well, I didn't need pushing into logic because um, logic is the kind of the place where philosophy and mathematics meet.
Hmm.
And ever since the revolution in logic at the beginning of around the turn of the 20th century,
Hmm.
logic has been a highly mathematical subject. And my doctorate was actually in mathematical logic. So that was
Hmm.
um, a natural bridge.
Hmm.
Um, but what pushed me towards philosophy was that it's sort of, let's put it this way. When you learn mathematics, there's not much you can argue about. The proofs are either right or wrong, more or less. And there's nothing much to debate. Whereas what I loved about philosophy was that it was issues, some of them really important to people's lives, where people disagree and you could discuss these things and you could argue about them. And I really loved that.
Yeah, everything is contentious in philosophy. Nothing
Yeah, that's
guaranteed.
right. Which is not to say that you can believe anything you damn well like and it's all equally good. That's why we discuss these things and try to come to some kind of consensus over the ideas. But you're right. I mean, philosophy is one of those areas where you can legitimately challenge anything. I think that's one of the defining characteristics of philosophy. So, if you study economics or philosophy or history or whatever, there are certain things which are taken for granted. And if you challenge them, you cease to become a professional economist, mathematician, historian, or what. Whereas philosophy, there are norms in the profession, but you know, philosophy gives you the intellectual entitlement to say, yeah, well, why do you think that? Okay, I know most people have assumed that, but hey, lots of things that people have assumed have been wrong. And if you say that, you don't get kicked out of the profession. Okay. So this is an aspect of philosophy, I think, which makes it very distinctive.
Mhm. And then to talk a little bit about logic, in your book, you put up the picture of Aristotle and you say the founder of formal logic. What exactly did Aristotle bring and kind of create with logic that wasn't there
Yeah.
beforehand?
Okay. Well, the origins of logic in the West, the East is a different story. We
Mhm.
can talk
Right.
about that if you want. But in the West, um, there have been philosophers, and before Aristotle, and of course, philosophers reason and argue. So people have been doing that. But Aristotle asked himself, well, when we argue, what are the rules of the game, as it were? And he was probably the first philosopher to try to settle the rules of the game. There was another group working a little bit later called the Stoics, and they came up with a different bunch of rules. But Aristotle had much more influence on the subject than the Stoics, although in the Middle Ages, both the Arabic and the Latin Middle Ages, people tried to take into account both the Stoic stuff and the Aristotelian stuff. But the Aristotelian stuff was more dominant in later logic. So he invented a system of logic, a bunch of rules for reasoning, which are usually called now syllogistic.
Hmm.
So that's rules for reasoning in a certain format. Um, there are things like inferences like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is mortal. Things like that. And syllogistic dominated with the Stoic accretions logic for the next, wow, really 2000 years. So it didn't really change much. I mean, there were additions, there were changes, there were modifications, there were disagreements, of course, but Aristotelian syllogistic provided the model really until the revolution in logic at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, when mathematicians got their teeth into logic really for the first time. And that's no accident because the mathematics you need really wasn't developed till the 19th century. It was axiomatics, model theory, combinatorics, and those are all very much 19th century developments.
I was gonna ask you as my next question. With the development of logic, we see like little bumps since Aristotle in like the medieval ages, but the big time that it really revolutionized was the 19th century.
Yeah,
Would you mentioned that it's because we didn't have these mathematical tools? Do you think that's the only reason we saw such a big bump in that era?
good question. Um, Not entirely. um, certainly those tools were necessary what was done subsequently.
Mhm.
Um, and there had been earlier attempts to sort of apply more formal techniques to logic than did Aristotle, particularly by Leibniz, who was, of course, a great mathematician himself. Um, but in retrospect, if you look at what he did, he was sort of he really needed the tools of modern mathematics to do it. So yeah, the fact that they became available is a part of the story, but it's not the only part because if you look at the development of mathematics itself in the 19th century, this mathematicians sometimes call this the century of rigor. So the foundations of mathematics at the start of the 19th century were a bit of a mess. Um, People were using systems of numbers like real numbers and infinitesimals and so on, and no one really had a good grounding of what these conceptual systems were. They had a bunch of rules and so on, but if you ask mathematicians at that time, well, what are these damn things you're arguing with? They weren't very good answers. And what happened in the 19th century was that many mathematicians, many of them German, came up with good answers to these questions. So Virtas, Dedekind, and company. Um, and uh, so these people really put mathematics on a much more secure footing than it had been before. Now, by the time that Frege comes on the scene, which is the end of the 19th century, um, most of this hard work had been done. What hadn't been done was the previous century had reduced all mathematical systems to the natural numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and sets thereof. Okay. What hadn't been done was that we didn't have a good understanding of the natural numbers themselves. And Frege's main project was to answer that question. So Frege was a mathematician, but he also was probably the greatest logician since Aristotle, because to answer this question, he needed to construct a theory of the natural numbers and reason about them. And when he did this, it became clear that the kind of traditional logic of his time, which was essentially a kind of a version of syllogistic, really was not up to the job of doing this.
Mhm.
So he invented a new system of reasoning. He called it Begriffsschrift, the concept writing, concept script. Um, and this was really the foundation of contemporary logic. I mean, it was taken by later logicians, improved, fiddled with, the way logicians do. Um, but he really invented what we now think of as modern logic. So to come back to your question, it it wasn't just the application of mathematical tools. It was to do this for a very specific reason, namely to provide an account of the natural numbers. And he had a theory of the natural numbers which crashed spectacularly in the worst possible way because it was discovered to be inconsistent. No, this was discovered by Bertrand Russell, a British mathematician. So his foundational project failed significantly. But as a sort of byproduct of his foundational project, he actually produced the Begriffsschrift. So as a sort of, in a way that he could never have imagined, he revolutionized logic itself. So that's another important part of the story.
Um, in a past interview, you said that the way Asian traditions reasoned was wrong, Arabic reasoning was bad, Chinese reasoning was bad, Indian reasoning was bad. What do you mean when you say that they're bad or they're wrong? What specifically, where do they fall short in their reasoning?
Okay, look, I don't think I've ever said they were bad. Um, I might have said they've been superseded by the revolution in logic.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, but uh, Aristotle's logic was a significant achievement, and uh, it was probably about as good as you could do at the time. It was taken up by Arabic and Latin logicians who
Mm,
made significant additions, changes, articulations, the Aristotelian and the Stoic picture. And these were great developments in logic. I would not call them bad at all, but they did the best they could within the conceptual framework they had. Okay. Um, but the conceptual framework available to logicians changed significantly in the 19th century, as we've been talking about. Um, and it must be said that it's not possible to go back. That there is still lots to be learnt from um, earlier periods, but the developments in mathematics and logic at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century just changed the game completely, and we ain't going back. Um, so that's the West. The East is similar. There were systems of logic in the East. Sometimes they had different metaphysical underlying pictures. We can talk about that if you want. But there's sort of their sophistication was about the same level as the sophistication in the West at similar periods.
mhm,
So there was never the revolution in logic in the West um, made what was going on in the East not exactly obsolete, but it changed the ball game. And it's only just now that some philosophers and logicians in the West are starting to think about how you apply the techniques of modern mathematical logic to the earlier theories in the East, in the way that we're still doing about the West. So people are now going back to revisit the logic of Leibniz and Aristotle and apply modern mathematical techniques and learn about, learn more about the framework that these guys produced. And the same is true of uh, what happened in the East in logic, although it's taken logicians longer to get around to this because the West knew much less about Eastern philosophy.
mm. And what do you think are, you've been teaching philosophy and logic for quite a while now. What do you think
Longer than
are,
I care to remember.
what are like the biggest misconceptions that you see students bring into your logic classes, say?
Leave students aside for a moment, I'll come back to that.
Sure.
Um, when students come into a class in logic, they don't really know what to expect. Some of them have a bit of a mathematical background, some don't. The ones with the mathematical background tend to find it very easily. The ones with a mathematical background sometimes struggle. They're
Mm,
kind of symbol phobic. Okay, that's something you've got to attack. Um, do they have misconceptions? Well, um, they could have many. That depends on where they're coming from. The ones with a computer science background tend to think very much in computational terms, and there is that aspect to logic.
mm,
But logic goes way beyond that. Um, the ones with a non-mathematical background might think that it's going to teach them how to reason. It doesn't, any more than learning linguistics teach you how to speak properly, right? People speak without knowledge of linguistics. People reason without a knowledge of formal logic. I mean, if you want to learn how to reason, you don't study logic. I mean, this will get me into bad trouble with the profession, but you learn places where you're forced to reason in a very disciplined way, like mathematics and law. Okay. All right. So that's what I'm going to say about students. Um, but in the general public,
mhm,
from which I suppose students are drawn, uh, people seem to identify logic with how best to put this, holding a sensible, sane view. It's logical if it kind of stacks up, and it's illogical if it doesn't. Okay, so you might want to say. Well, Trump put all these taxes on the imports. That's illogical because it's just uh, raising the cost of imports, and so the consumer price index. Okay,
Mhm.
you hear that kind of thing. Now, logic's not about that at all. Um, in logic, it's about how to reason. Reasons have premises and conclusions. Premises are the things you take for granted when you draw conclusions, and conclusions are what you infer from these. Now, logic is concerned with the relationship between premise and conclusions. The premises are someone else's business. Okay, so logic as such will tell you nothing about the economy, nothing at all about taxes, nothing at all about imports, or about biological situations, or physical situations, or chemical situations. That's the job of some other profession, right? So, what logic will do, or what logicians can do, is tells you what follows from those assumptions or theories that are provided by other disciplines. So, if an economist tells you something about economic principles and draws conclusions from that, then the logician is in a position to say, well, that really doesn't follow, or that does follow. That's the logician's business.
Mm.
But the sort of principles that are invoked in economics or whatever
Mhm.
are going to be someone else's business. So um, a lot of people identify logic with sort of having a sound view about things. And logic, as modern logicians conceive it, is actually much more restricted and specialized than that.
You mentioned, well, you didn't mention, but logic is notoriously kind of a difficult thing to define. But to people who may be unfamiliar with the field, how would you explain to them what exactly a logician studies or does?
Yeah. Well, I'd sort of pick up on what I've just said
Mm.
and articulate that a bit more. So let me try and do that. Um, everybody reasons, right? And one thing we know because of studies in cognitive psychology is that people often reason very badly. They have that even people who studied Logic 100 are known to reason very badly, okay, because there are systematic errors that people make. Now, why they make those errors, okay, that's a topic for cognitive psychologists, but
Mhm.
they do. So logic is not concerned so much with how people actually reason, because we know that they do it badly. Reason Logic is concerned with the norms of correct reasoning. That's a different matter, because we know that those get violated by people often. So, what does it mean to study the norms of correct reasoning? Well, as I just said, when you reason, you've got some stuff that you accept, at least for the sake of argument, and then you try and infer things that follows from that. You know, take the sort of baby example I just gave you.
Mhm.
All people are mortal. Socrates is a person, so Socrates is mortal. That follows. Okay. Suppose I say all people are mortal. Socrates was mortal, therefore Socrates is a cow. You say what? Okay. Now that's a stupid example, but
Mm.
it tells you that some things follow and some things don't, right? And logicians are concerned with what does follow, and more importantly, why. So what logicians do is construct theories of so if an inference, if an inference has a conclusion that really does follow, logicians call it valid,
Mhm.
or the inference valid. Um, so logic is a study of validity. So what logicians will do is construct theories of validity. They'll tell you which inferences are valid, which aren't, and why. So that those theories will nowadays use quite strong, high-powered mathematical techniques. But what the game in town is to account for why things are valid. Okay, and there's several approaches to this are known. The mathematical details get complex quickly, so I'm not going to go into those unless you really want me to. Um, but that's what logicians do. That's their prime question. In the process, they investigate. lots of the details of the mathematical machinery, but also lots of philosophical issues that arise when you try to tackle these questions. So when I say you try to answer that question, that might sound not very exciting stuff, a bit like doing a crossword puzzle, okay? But because the topic has roots which drive deep into um, how bits of mathematics function and the philosophical issues that arise when you're trying to address that question, it actually goes quite deep into both mathematics and philosophy.
You reflected a little bit about how important validity is to logic, but it's a word that's often used interchangeably with validity, and maybe it shouldn't be, is soundness.
Yes.
How concerned are logicians with soundness, and how do you distinguish these two things?
Yeah. Okay. Look, the word sound can mean different things, uh, but it's a technical term in logic. Um, and what it means is that if I give you an argument, give you the premises and the conclusion,
Mhm.
um, a sound argument is one which is where the argument is valid, so the conclusion really does follow, but also where the premises are true. Okay, so if I give you an argument, uh, for you to be persuaded by it, it has to be more than valid because I can conclude all kinds of things from crazy premises.
Mhm.
If I reason, let me see, uh, New York City is in New York State. New York State is in China, therefore New York City is in China. That's a perfectly valid inference,
Mhm.
right? It's just that one of the premises is wacko. Okay. So a sound argument is where the inference is valid, but also the premises are true. And as I've said, that tends to be someone else's business.
Mhm.
Um, uh, so that's how logicians apply the word soundness. Uh,
Mhm.
and in the vernacular, sound means, persuasive.
Mhm.
Um, that's not quite the same as what I've just said,
Right.
because there are all kinds of things that can make an argument persuasive or unpersuasive, other than what I've just said. But it's generally in the same ballpark.
Mm. What about something, how does something like ex fossil quadlibet factor into that? Like, what if I said all men are mortal, all men are immortal, therefore Socrates is a cow? Isn't that a perfectly valid argument? It's just unsound.
Yes, that's true. Well, okay, look, um, let, 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 let me sort of fill out the picture a bit.
Yeah.
So, X was a quadlibet, if you want to give it a sort of snappier name, explosion, uh, is the inference of the form. Once you've got a contradiction, everything follows. So Trump is corrupt, Trump is not corrupt. So the Earth has 17 moons. That's a valid inference, right? Um, if you don't think contradictions can be true, it ain't going to be sound because the premise is not true. Okay, that's coming to be contested, but set that aside for the moment. Now, um, that inference explosion doesn't sound particularly valid. Okay. If you go into a teacher class of 100 and you say, hey guys, girls, whatever, I'm going to give you an inference. You tell me whether the conclusion follows. Trump is corrupt, Trump is not corrupt, so the Earth has 17 moons. They'll say, duh, that's not valid, that's stupid. Why? Because the conclusion hasn't has no relation to the premises. One's about Trump, one's about moons. How can they be related? Okay. So it comes as a surprise to most students that if you take Logic 100, you'll be taught essentially the logic was invented by Frege and subsequently polished by lots of other great logicians. And according to that view, explosion is valid. What? Okay, okay. It's not quite as wacky as it sounds. Um, uh, it turns out that it's valid, but only kind of vacuously because the premises can't be true. So it's not a very interesting. Well, so Okay, it's not quite as wacky as it sounds. There is a kind of rationale. Okay, now that inference itself is kind of orthodox in modern in Logic 100, um, but its orthodoxy is relatively recent.
Mhm.
It's never occurred in Eastern logic. It doesn't feature in Western logic until about the 12th century. So no one comes up with arguments like this till about the 12th century. So it's a Latin invention. And in Latin logic, it's kind of contentious. So it's debated by the Latin logicians. Um, Latin logic is all the advances in Latin logic are forgotten in the Renaissance, Reformation. Um, so logic goes back to being syllogistic, and syllogistic says that explosion is invalid. And Aristotle points this out himself. So explosion does not become valid, so explosion does not become accepted, orthodox, until the Phrygian revolution in logic. And since then, many non-Phrygian systems of logic have been invented because Phrygian logic has lots of problems, as
Mhm.
logicians know. Um, Frege logic is now called classical logic, not
Mhm.
because it has anything to do with the classics. It's not valid in, any of the systems of logic of the great classical situations like ancient Greece or Rome. It's classical in the sense that it's kind of standard. It's what you'll learn in a first course in logic. Um, but we now know there are many non-classical systems of logic too, systems of logic that differ from Phrygian logic. Some of those validate explosion as well. Some of them don't. The ones that don't are now called para-consistent logics. Uh, and there's a debate that goes on in the literature in sort of logic journals nowadays as to about which system of logic is right, classical or non-classical. If it's non-classical, which non-classical? There's even a debate about whether that whole question makes sense. What does it mean to say one question of logic is right? One system of logic is right. Okay. Um, so all those debates go on in the logic journals nowadays. Um, but to say that explosion is valid is kind of to misdescribe the situation. I mean,
Mhm.
it's certainly taken to be valid in classical logic, a number of non-classical logics, but whether or not these are the right system of logic, even what that means, is not clear. And that's a philosophical debate that currently logicians are having.
Sometimes in logic, you often hear reference to the laws of logic.
Yeah,
In your view, what are the laws of logic? Do you think they're like discovered, invented? Are they real laws of logic? I know you have a problem with a big one of them,
yeah.
more broadly.
Look, if you look at how that phrase is used before the 20th century, um, the laws of logic are usually identified with the laws of thought. Yeah, what people think. Okay. Uh, and three of them are kind of often single out. Um, law of non-contradiction, law of exceeding middle, and law of identity. And never mind if we can talk about those if you want, but those are three that are singled out usually. Um, and they're identified with the way that people think. We now know that cannot be true because people often think illogically. Okay. So um, the laws of logic, if there be such things, cannot be anything to do with the way that people actually think. They're connected with the norms of the norms of correct thinking. Okay. Uh, Specifically the norms of correct inference, the norms of validity. Um, to the extent that you hear that phrase used nowadays,
Mhm.
it has to be identified with something like the norms of correct inference.
Mhm.
What those norms are is contentious because we now know there are lots of systems of logic, and which one, if any, is right is a philosophically contentious matter. Um, so, what often is called a laws of logic, like explosion, might be wrong,
Mhm.
just as, what you hear called the laws of physics, like Newton's laws of motion, can be wrong. We now think Newton got it wrong. Okay. But we still talk about the Newtonian laws of motion. Um, but might be better to say that some people think that laws of physics, laws of logic are correct, but whether they're correct is always going to be a contentious matter, whether it's physics, whether it's logic, or whether it's economics, or other areas which have their kind of canonical principles, at least for the present.
But you're saying you don't really believe in like a kind of Platonic idea of these forms that are laws of logic that really exist out there in the world that we discover.
Yeah, sorry, I missed that aspect of your
No, no
question.
worries.
Um, okay, um, so let's talk about the principles of correct reasoning. Let's call them laws, since we're assuming that we've got them correct. Okay, what makes something a law of logic? Now, this comes back to the point I raised earlier that a theory of logic will tell you not just what inferences are correct, it'll tell you why. Okay. And the story that goes there will answer your question. What makes something a correct law of logic? Now, there are several possible candidates on the table. One of them is kind of the Platonic view that you sort of indicated just now, namely that there are these kind of abstract principles enshrined in some Platonic heaven, which we're trying to discover. Okay, um, that's a view that some people have. It was actually that view or something close to it was Frege's.
Mhm.
Um, so he had the view, and you don't sort of dismiss a view of one of the greatest logicians in a cavalier fashion. Um, uh, but there are other possibilities. Um, some people think that what makes an inference valid is that it's valid in virtue of the meanings of the words. Now we have to worry about how words get their meaning. Okay,
Mhm.
and that's a deep problem in the philosophy of language.
Yeah.
Um, but what some logicians will tell you is that if you take the sort of very high profile logical particles like if, not, and, or. Um, I've just used certain English words, but of course there are cognate words in other languages. And they're words of, let's just say, English for the moment, and they have rules of use. You can capture the rules of use in certain formal rules, and inferences are valid in virtue of those forms. So therefore, if I say, well, let's consider the following inference. Um, Mary has a red hat and a red dress. So Mary has a red hat.
Mhm.
That sounds okay. Why is that okay? Well, if you're a sort of the kind of logician I've just described, you'll say it's because of the way we use the word and.
Mhm.
If we use the word and differently, well, that wouldn't be okay. If we use the word and as we now use the word or, that wouldn't follow at all. But as a matter of fact, that's how we use the word and. So inferences are valid because of the meanings of the words we use. Okay, so that's another possibility. There are others. Sometimes they get more technical, but there isn't a consensus amongst logicians of what makes inferences valid or invalid. It's going to depend on various other things, and whether or not you discover them or invent them is going to turn on what kind of theory you give about why things are valid.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, in some ways, it's a bit like linguistics. I
Mhm.
mean, when you construct a theory of linguistics, are you tracking something that's objectively there, or are you just tracking the norms of linguistic usage? Now, if you're someone like Chomsky, you're going to say, well, there's this kind of deep structure which is embedded in our cognition, which we're trying to discover. But some people will say, no, um, you're just tracking the way we use language. So Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, would have said that. So as I said, Logic has these roots which sink deep into hard philosophical problems, and some of those have just surfaced.
Somebody may who's not very interested in logic, maybe listening to this and here saying like Socrates is a man,
Mhm.
Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is immortal. Like I can do that. I can do this
Sure,
logic stuff.
sure.
So why do I need to read this book and do all this? What would you say to somebody like that?
Well, look, everyone reasons.
Mhm.
People make mistakes, but people are pretty good at it. And if you stick with very simple inferences, um, then probably you're not going to make too many mistakes. The inference about Socrates, you know, that's pretty obvious, right? Uh, so the trouble is that I gave you a very simple toy example
Yeah.
because when reasoning gets serious, we go a long way beyond these toy examples.
Mhm.
So that if you look at the inferences that are used by lawyers, economists, philosophers, uh, matters are not at all obvious.
Mhm.
And if you want to engage in sophisticated reasoning, you've got to go beyond these kind of baby examples.
Mhm.
So let me just give you one example. Um, I mean, this is on my mind because I've just been looking at the argument for the existence of God that was produced by the great Arabic philosopher Ibn Sina.
Mhm.
Okay, arguments for the existence of God have been produced in the West for 2,000 years now by Islamic philosophers, Christian philosophers. There's a whole raft of these arguments for the existence of God, um, which have been debated by philosophers and logicians now for 2,000 years, and they're actually very sophisticated. You look at the arguments of people like Ibn Sina, of Anselm, of Aquinas, of Leibniz, of there are even arguments produced by Gödel, who's probably the second most famous logician of the 20th century. And these arguments are very sophisticated, and if you can't analyze them with sort of all men are mortal type inferences because these arguments use sophisticated principles of descriptions, of modality. Never mind if you don't understand what those are, there are aspects of logic which go way beyond anything that you find in Aristotle. So, some of the principles that used in these arguments are highly contentious. Hey, so you're reasoning about things which matter to people, the existence of God, for example. Well, it matters to some people anyway. Um, and do these arguments work? Well, you're never going to settle that without a quite sophisticated analysis of how the inferences in these arguments function. Okay, now I've chosen just one example, namely philosophy of religion. But I could have chosen an example from economics or from physics or many other areas, or from law for that matter. Um, so it's just an example to show you that uh, if you want to get sophisticated about reasoning, you're going to have to go a long way beyond these sort of baby arguments.
An example that comes to mind is like, because that's more deductive reasoning. There's
Yes,
really no way that those
yes,
premises can be true and it not be. But something like, it's still quite a baby example, like the sun rises every day, therefore the sun will rise tomorrow. This kind of thing. That is not a deductive statement, but it's still
correct,
true.
correct. So look, what you're pointing out is something very important. Namely, logicians tend to draw a distinction between deductive inferences and non-deductive inferences. So deductive inference is the one where um, if the premises are true, the conclusion's got to be true in some sense, which we try to figure out. Whereas with a non-deductive inference, it could be the case that the premises are true, um, and they do provide some support for the conclusion, but it's not conclusive because it's just possible the premises could be true and the conclusion is not. Okay. So you gave an example of one of these, but there are many. Um, so a very important one is a very important non-deductive inference is sometimes called abduction. So we've got all this data in, say, physics about how the planets move. We look at them in the sky and we see them here tonight, there tomorrow night, and so on.
Mhm.
So we then want to construct a theory about what moves the planets. Okay. And of course, as you know, Newton was very successful in this. Um, but the data itself will not tell you what the right theory is. You're constructing a theory which explains the data, um, and you want a theory which best explains the data.
Mm.
And the inference to that theory will not be a deductive one because the data does not entail the theory, right? Um, but the kind of inference is a kind of inference says, hey, here's a theory and it's the best inference, the best theory we've got given the data. That's called abduction, and that's a non-deductive argument. Okay, so this is an important distinction, and it must be said that logicians have paid a lot more attention to deductive inferences than non-deductive inferences. I mean, the awareness of the distinction goes all the way back to Aristotle. So, the distinction is not a new one, but for better or for worse, uh, logicians haven't paid as much attention to non-deductive inferences as they have to deductive inferences. Maybe that's for sociological reasons, because philosophers have tended to be um, uh, theologians or mathematicians rather than doctors or lawyers. Now, if you're a doctor or a lawyer, you pay much more attention um, to non-deductive inferences than mathematicians or theologians. Um, so, if you look at the articulation of theories of non-deductive inferences, they're much less sophisticated now than those for deductive inferences. Um, Although a lot of work nowadays does go into non-deductive inferences, and something like a general framework for non-deductive inferences is emerging. So non-deductive inferences are often called non-monotonic, and they're called non-monotonic. What that means is you've got these inferences, you might have a good inferences, but if you throw in some extra premises, the conclusion no longer follows. And that can happen because the premises of a non-deductive inference don't entail the conclusion. So something can come along and disrupt that.
Mhm.
Um, so a non-monotonic inference is one that's valid, but if you get some extra premises, the conclusion no longer follows. And particularly as a result of work in computer science, we're or computer science logic, we're now seeing quite sophisticated theories of non-monotonic inference. Um, they still don't match the theories of deductive inference, but um, uh, they're starting to approach that, I think. So this is an area of logic that has been very largely neglected, I think, until the present day.
Mhm. Do you think that in philosophy departments there needs to be more of an emphasis on logic in the curriculum?
Yeah.
You don't think it's enough now? You think that there should be like philosophy students need to engage much more with this kind of formal logic?
Okay. Look, times are changing.
Mhm.
Uh, if you look at philosophy classes in the Anglosphere, now I'm not talking about Europe or Asia because there's different, but let's just talk about the Anglosphere.
Mhm.
If you look at Anglo philosophy of 40 years ago, um, it was dominated by philosophy of language, philosophy of science, philosophy of logic. Um, so often philosophy is divided up into two spheres. The Europeans call them theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy. Theoretical philosophy has to do with epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of language, logic. Practical philosophy has to do with norms. So moral philosophy, political philosophy, aesthetics. Um, and 40 years ago, Anglo philosophy was dominated by theoretical philosophy, and theoretical philosophy at that time was dominated by logic. You just couldn't do the philosophy of language, philosophy of science without understanding formal logic. And so formal logic was an integral part of the curriculum 40 or 50 years ago. You just couldn't do current contemporary philosophy without it. All right. This is now changing because, for one reason, the center of gravity of center of gravity of philosophy has changed. And in the Anglosphere, theoretical philosophy is now less important, I think, than practical philosophy. So if I look at the sort of grad students that I know at the grad center, there are more of them who are interested in ethics, political philosophy, aesthetics than would have been the case 40 years ago. And it's never been the case that those areas of philosophy has been that it's never been the case that logic has been integral to those areas of philosophy. So you don't really need to study formal logic to be engaged with those areas. You can be a perfectly good aesthetician without knowing much formal logic. Okay. Same goes for political philosophy or whatever. So logic is not central to those areas. But even in theoretical philosophy, uh, theoretic, theoretical philosophy is not dominated by formal logic in the way that it used to be 40 years ago. Now, there are still certain areas of theoretical philosophy where it is. You cannot do contemporary metaphysics, for example, or obviously philosophy of logic without a knowledge of formal logic. But if you look at areas like philosophy of science, philosophy of language, you can often do those without a profound knowledge of formal logic, because debates in those areas have also moved in the direction of practical philosophy. Um, so issues in epistemology, one issue that's become large is the areas that are produced by feminist philosophy, which concerns the kind of value latenness of the enterprises. And those are important. So even in theoretical philosophy, the center of gravity is sort of nudged a bit towards practical philosophy.
Mhm.
Um, so the sort of total upshot of that is that formal logic is not central to the study of philosophy in the way that it was 40 years ago. So what we've seen is that many departments now will have an introductory course on logic, but no more. And often the introductory course on logic is not taught by a logician. It's taught by some poor bastard who is told to teach logic because no one else wants to do it. So they get a book off the shelf and just sort of teach the students. They go through the book chapter by chapter, which is not a great way of learning logic, but it happens. Um, so logic is not now central to the curriculum in the Anglosphere in the way that it used to be 40 years ago. Sorry, that's a long answer to your question, but I hope I got there in the end.
No, you did. So it sounds like modern philosophy is kind of, at least in the academic sphere, and when you're learning it, it's moving away from this kind of formal systematic logic.
Well, um, formal logic is still taught, and if you want to study certain areas of philosophy, it's absolutely essential. But a lot of logic, especially the stuff that sort of moves towards the area of practical philosophy, it's not, and it never has been. Okay. Um, it's just that those areas of philosophy and practical philosophy are much more exciting now than they were 40 or 50 years ago, right? Um, so it's not as though the importance of formal logic has disappeared. It's just that it's not as centrally placed to the study of logic that it was.
My last question I have for you is, what advice would you have for somebody like myself who is beginning to study philosophy and logic?
Yeah. Well, that could depend on all kinds of things about you and your context and what you want to do, right?
Mhm.
Um, uh, Look, first of all, You cannot do this stuff without a decent education. And I'm afraid that means studying it at a university. So I get sent lots of things by kind of amateur philosophers, and I don't use that word in a derogatory fashion. But these are people who've never really studied philosophy. So they're not professional philosophers. That's what I mean. Okay. And they have some interesting ideas and they write them down and they think they've solved great problems. And of course, they want comment from me or they want recognition or whatever. But these ideas are kind of amateur in the sense that they're what you'd expect from someone who's never studied professional philosophy. Let me give you an analogy. Um, Suppose you study baseball at school, right? And you're a good baseballer at school. Okay, you've got certain skills. You're still an amateur. You're not going to make the professional leagues unless you go and you train properly, right? I'm afraid philosophy is the same. If you have a sort of bunch of ideas and sort of have natural ability, you're not going to make the big leagues unless you go and study it properly, like the training you get in the major leagues in baseball, right? So the sad news is, you're never going to cut it as a significant philosopher without a professional training. For better or for worse, that's the sad news. Okay. So you've got to do that. That's the first thing about my answer to your question. Second thing is it ain't easy. Um, Even if you're naturally gifted, you're going to have to work hard at it because some of it's going to be difficult. Logic is certainly difficult, but even the areas of philosophy that don't really involve logic, um, you, you when you study philosophy, you're going to be taught techniques for thinking about issues very carefully, draw distinctions that might not occur to you, think about consequences that might not occur to you. This is part of the training of a professional philosopher. It's like the training you get in the major leagues in baseball. And it ain't easy. Training in the major leagues in baseball ain't easy for good reason, because it's hard, right? And the same for better or for worse is true of philosophy. So you're going to have to study hard. And even if you have natural talent, you're, you, um, it's going to require hard work. You're not going to fly through it. Okay. So you've got to be prepared to work your ass off. Okay. That's the second answer. Third answer is one that you didn't ask, but sometimes gets asked me, which bits of philosophy should I study?
Mhm.
Philosophy is a broad area,
Yeah.
and it's like an area which has tentacles in everything else. It sort of spreads into mathematics, psychology, history, economics, psychology, so for any X, there's a philosophy of X. And you can't study them all at once. Which one should you study? The answer is the one that interests you most.
Mhm.
Do that because that's what you'll do best at. And if you hang around for a long time, your interest will spread. But start with the stuff that engages you most because that's what will motivate you to do the hard work and produce the best results. So that's sort of three answers to your question.
Well, it's two more than I asked for, so that's perfect. Thank you so much, Graham. I
Yeah,
hope you have a great day. Thank you so much for helping me and speaking with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
you're welcome. Good luck with whatever comes next.
Thank you. You as well. Good luck in your career. Thank you.
Ciao,
Bye-bye.
ciao.